On a crisp morning in Washington, an elderly janitor named Marcus Johnson stood at the steps of the Capitol, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady. They called him Nighthawk, though the world never knew his name. For decades, he lived in the shadows, a forgotten veteran, his story buried by the very country he served. But when a Navy commander spoke his code name aloud, the silence shattered. What happens next is a journey of honor, redemption, and a quiet courage that refused to be erased. Stay with us as we uncover the remarkable truth of the man America almost forgot. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The town of Westridge woke early, each day unfolding beneath a sky streaked with steel gray. The clang of metal against metal, the murmur of tired workers, and the faint scent of machine oil gave the morning its rhythm. It was a place where the factory whistle decided when life began and ended. Marcus Johnson walked these streets long before the sun rose. He moved with the quiet precision of a man who had trained himself to be both watchful and invisible. In his small, one-bedroom apartment, nothing was out of place. A battered alarm clock, ticking softly in the corner, a chipped mug that read, "World's Best Grandpa," though he had no grandchildren. His uniform gray coveralls, name patch carefully pressed, hung on the back of the door. Ready for another day. Marcus rose each morning at 5:30 sharp, the habit of discipline ingrained deep in his bones. 20 push-ups to remind his body it could still move. A plain breakfast: oatmeal, banana, black coffee, fuel for a man who asked for nothing. The walk to the plant was 12 blocks, and he took each step like he'd been trained to do so. He moved without hurry, but with purpose, every motion efficient. For Marcus, there was a kind of peace in routine, no surprises, no expectations. At the factory gate, the security guard gave him a cursory glance, barely a nod. Inside, the building hummed with life machines roaring, men shouting orders, the air thick with sweat and steam. Marcus found comfort in the noise. It kept questions away. The janitorial closet doubled as his refuge, a place of worn mops and chemical smells, where he could slip on his mask of invisibility. "Morning, old-timer," said Derek, a young man with restless eyes. "Good morning," Marcus replied softly, eyes down, never meeting Derek's smirk. He'd learned long ago that eye contact could invite trouble, that in places like this, a black man's best armor was silence. So he bent his head and let the world look past him. Reed, the plant manager, was the kind of man who filled a room just by standing in it. He was younger than Marcus by decades, but carried himself like a king in his little kingdom. He never used Marcus's name. "Johnson," Reed said that morning, not looking up from his clipboard. "There's a mess in the executive washroom. Make sure it's spotless before the tour." He didn't wait for a reply. He never did. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." It was always sir, always with that small bow of the head that told the other man he wouldn't challenge him. He gripped the bottle of cleaner a little tighter than he meant to. As he worked, scrubbing tile and polishing brass, his mind stayed quiet. His body moved with practiced grace, but there was a weight in his shoulders that never quite lifted. He remembered what it was to carry something heavier than a mop. He remembered how to blend into shadows and move without a sound. But those days, he reminded himself, were gone. Here, he was just Marcus Johnson, the janitor. The old black man no one noticed. At the other end of the plant, the main floor was buzzing with preparations for the military visit. Rumors said the Navy was coming to discuss a new contract, more money, more jobs. Reed strutted through the halls like a rooster, barking orders, making sure every corner gleamed. "Johnson," he snapped later, pointing to the conference room door. "Stay out of sight tomorrow. We don't need distractions." He didn't say what he meant, but Marcus understood. "Yet, sir," Marcus said again. No fight in his voice, no defiance. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who'd spent a lifetime making himself small. But behind those calm eyes, there was something deeper, something that didn't belong to a man who only pushed a mop, a steadiness, an awareness, like he was always measuring the room, like he was listening for things no one else could hear. That afternoon, as Marcus wiped down the hall near the executive offices, he felt it a shift in the air. Footsteps, deliberate and measured. Voices that carried authority. He didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. Commander James Wilson walked at the head of the group, his Navy uniform sharp, his presence calm but commanding. He paused mid-sentence, his eyes catching on the figure by the brass rail. For a brief moment, Wilson's gaze narrowed, curiosity flickering across his face. Marcus felt it, the scrutiny, the question behind the polite uniform. Their eyes met for just a heartbeat. Then Marcus looked away, mop in hand, blending once more into the quiet corners of the room. Wilson said nothing. He turned back to his officers. But something about that brief exchange stayed with him. A feeling, a memory, maybe of a man he'd never met, but who carried himself like someone who had seen things. Marcus moved down the hallway, his steps steady. He didn't look back, didn't let his shoulders tense. But deep inside, an old part of him woke up, just for a moment. In the safe quiet of his closet later, Marcus leaned against the door, breathing slow. He told himself it was nothing, just another visitor, just another day. But he knew better. Tomorrow would bring more than brass speeches and contract handshakes. Tomorrow would bring questions he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. And for the first time in years, Marcus Johnson let himself wonder if the world would finally see him, not as a janitor, but as the man he truly was. The next morning dawned with a thin veil of mist over Westridge. Marcus moved through his apartment like a ghost, each step measured and careful. The air smelled of stale coffee and old memories. Commander Wilson woke early too, the questions from the day before echoing in his mind. He sat at his desk, the glow of the computer screen washing over him in the dim light. He searched the name Marcus Johnson, but every file he pulled up was thin, like someone had swept away the real story. He called in a favor. An old friend at the Pentagon. "Do you know anything about a Marcus Johnson?" he asked, voice low. There was a pause, then a sigh. "That name doesn't come up in any of our files," his friend said. "But if you're asking, be careful. James, there are things you're not supposed to find." The line went dead before Wilson could say another word. At the factory, Marcus felt eyes on him that day, eyes that didn't belong to the workers he'd spent years ignoring. He scrubbed the floor with a steady hand, but his mind was somewhere else, listening for footsteps that didn't echo. The whispers started too. Derek, the young janitor, glanced at Marcus with something like suspicion. "Old man, you okay?" Derek asked once, but Marcus just nodded and kept moving. He didn't have time to explain, not to someone who wouldn't understand. That afternoon, Marcus's phone buzzed as he walked home. A blocked number, no name on the screen. He answered anyway, pressing the phone tight to his ear. A voice he didn't recognize, calm, almost cold. "Stay invisible." "Nighthawk," it said. "They're looking again." Marcus stopped in his tracks. The world around him went silent, just the distant echo of traffic and the wind rustling through the trees. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the name settle in his chest like an old wound opening up. He walked the rest of the way home by back alleys, routes he hadn't taken in years. A habit from another life, one that never really left. At the corner diner, he slipped into a booth at the very back, his back to the wall. He ordered coffee and sat quietly, eyes scanning the door, the windows. It wasn't paranoia, it was training. The old instincts still lived in his bones, even if his body had grown slower. Meanwhile, Wilson couldn't let it go. He spent the day making phone calls, meeting dead ends at every turn. Each refusal only fueled his determination. Late that evening, Wilson stood in his hotel room, the weight of his dress uniform pressing down on his shoulders. He looked out the window at the lights of the town below, wondering why this mattered so much. But deep down, he already knew. He remembered the look in Marcus's eyes, steady, calm, but with a depth that said he'd seen more than anyone in that room. Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was more than just a man with a mop. He needed to know the truth. At the factory the next morning, preparations were in full swing for the big military ceremony. Banners hung from the rafters, and the air was sharp with the scent of fresh paint and nervous energy. Marcus worked in the shadows, polishing railings, sweeping floors, doing the work no one saw. Reed caught his eye, his mouth twisting into a frown. "Stay out of sight today. Johnson," he barked. "Important guests. We don't need you in the way." Marcus just nodded. "Yes, sir," he said softly, the words smooth from years of practice. But inside, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't let himself feel in decades' defiance. Wilson arrived at the plant with the Navy delegation, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He moved through the hallways with measured steps, each glance sweeping over the workers who lined up to shake hands, to smile, to pretend they weren't just another face in the crowd. But it was Marcus he was looking for. He found him in a side hallway, head down, pushing a mop along the polished floor. Their eyes met, just for a breath. Wilson's heart thudded. Marcus kept moving, but the moment lingered. The quiet message in that look, not yet, not here, but soon. The ceremony began in the main auditorium. The factory's best and brightest gathered in neat rows. American flags lined the stage, and Reed beamed as he introduced the Navy officers. The air was thick with forced smiles and polite applause. Marcus stood at the back, half hidden behind a column. He had no intention of staying long. He knew his place out of sight, out of mind. But then Wilson stepped to the podium. He spoke of honor, of duty, of the men who served in silence. And then he paused, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Marcus. "In every conflict," Wilson said, his voice steady, "there are those who serve without recognition." He let the words hang there, heavy and deliberate. Men like Nighthawk. The room fell silent. Reed shifted uncomfortably, eyes narrowing as he followed Wilson's stare. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Marcus froze, his hands tightening around the mop handle. For a moment, everything went still. The banners, the flags, the polite faces. Wilson held his gaze. "He's here today." Wilson continued. "A man who carried out missions we may never fully know, who wore no medals but whose actions saved lives." A hush swept the room. Marcus took a breath, the world narrowing to the beat of his heart. He felt every eye on him, now felt the weight of secrets he'd buried for decades. But he didn't look away. For the first time in years, he lifted his head and met the world's gaze head-on. The mop slipped from his fingers, clattering to the polished floor. No one moved. No one spoke. Wilson gave a slight nod, an unspoken promise that the story would not be forgotten. Marcus stood still, the quiet dignity of a man who had carried both honor and silence on his shoulders. And in that moment, he understood the past was no longer his burden alone. The aftermath of Wilson's words spread like wildfire through the factory. Whispers turned into shouts as workers huddled in corners, replaying the moment on their phones. By the end of the day, the video had already begun to circulate online, the words Nighthawk echoing across small screens. Reed wasted no time. He cornered Marcus in the janitorial closet, his face red with anger. "What the hell was that?" "Johnson," he snapped. Marcus said nothing. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, calm even as Reed's voice rose. "You embarrass this company," Reed hissed, spittle on his lip. But Marcus didn't flinch. He'd faced worse than Reed's fury. Inside, he felt a quiet clarity he hadn't known in years. Wilson, meanwhile, found himself summoned to a conference room back at the base. His commanding officer waited there, eyes cold, voice even colder. "Commander Wilson," he began, "what were you thinking?" Wilson stood straight, his chin high. "Sir, I spoke the truth," he said simply. The officer's expression hardened. "You crossed a line," he said. "Those operations were never meant to see the light of day. You're jeopardizing national security. Wilson swallowed but held his ground. I understand, sir, he said, but some truths are too important to keep buried. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that could end a career. Back at his apartment, Marcus sat in the dim light of his small living room. His phone buzzed endlessly, messages from strangers, old friends, and people he hadn't spoken to in decades. But there was one number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was low, measured. Mr. Johnson, it said. Marcus said nothing, waiting. I know who you are. Nighthawk, the voice continued. More importantly, I want you to know the government has never forgotten. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he closed his eyes, memories flickering like old film reels. The voice went on, calm and deliberate. We kept your name in the shadows for reasons of national security. It said, but the world has changed. And it's time we made things right. Marcus let the words settle over him like a blanket he hadn't known he needed. Who are you? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause. Someone who believes in honoring the men who gave everything, even when history forgot them. Marcus sat in the silence that followed, the weight of decades pressing on his shoulders. Then the voice spoke again, softer now. I'd like to meet you, face to face. Can you come to Washington? He hesitated, but something inside him shifted. Yes, he said simply. The line went dead, but the promise remained. In the days that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath. The video of Wilson's speech had reached further than anyone expected. People began to ask questions about the man called Nighthawk, about the men like him who had been erased. Marcus received letters, some typed, some written in shaky cursive. A photograph arrived in the mail, 3 men in dusty uniforms. One of them, Marcus, younger, standing in the back. No note, just an unspoken memory. A small package came next, wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a silver dog tag, battered and worn. A note in careful handwriting for the mission that never existed. You never let us down. Marcus held it in his palm, feeling the weight of it. Each piece of mail was a piece of his past, come back to remind him who he was. But with each memory came a choice. He could slip back into the shadows, let the world believe what it wanted. Or he could step into the light, risk everything to tell the truth, not just for himself, but for every man who had been made invisible. He knew what he had to do. When the invitation from Washington arrived, it was formal and precise, an embossed seal, a letter that spoke of honor and duty, an acknowledgement that had been decades overdue. The night before he left, Marcus sat alone in his kitchen. He laid out the letters, the photographs, the dog tag, each one a testament to the life he had tried so hard to forget. Outside, the world moved on, but inside, he let himself feel the weight of it all. At dawn, he packed a small bag, nothing fancy, just enough. He took the old badge he kept hidden behind the refrigerator panel and slipped it into his coat pocket. Not as proof, but as a reminder. On the train to Washington, Marcus watched the countryside blur by. Memories came in flashes, briefings in dark rooms, the roar of helicopters at midnight, the whispered code names no one else ever knew. He felt them all, and he let them go. When he arrived at the federal building, a young aide met him at the entrance. The man was polite, deferential, his eyes wide with a kind of awe Marcus didn't recognize. "This way, sir," he said, guiding him through long marble halls. They led him to a small office where a tall man in uniform waited. The man stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "I'm General Harris. Thank you for coming." Marcus shook his hand, the grip firm, steady. "General," he said simply. The general gestured for him to sit, then took the chair across from him. "I won't pretend we did right by you," Harris said after a moment. You were asked to give everything, and when you did, we made you a ghost." His eyes were steady, but there was a sadness there too. "National security," he continued, "is a weight we all carry, but there comes a time when we have to set it down. It's time for your story to be told." Marcus. Marcus said nothing, but his silence was not refusal. "We'd like you to attend a ceremony," Harris said, "not just for you, but for every man who served in the shadows." He slid a formal invitation across the desk, the seal of the United States shimmering in the light. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. He thought of the years he spent cleaning floors no one saw, of the men who never came home, of the truth that had waited in the dark. He nodded slowly. "I'll be there," he said. Harris exhaled, relief in his expression. "Thank you." "Nighthawk," he said softly. "It's time." As Marcus left the office, he felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. This wasn't about medals or ceremonies anymore. It was about every man who'd ever been told to stay invisible. That night, back in his hotel room, Marcus received one final package. Inside was a battered photograph, his old team, standing in a jungle clearing, all of them young, all of them alive. Tucked behind it, a slip of paper and a familiar scrawl. "We're with you, brother, all the way." Marcus held it close, his eyes closing for a moment. In the morning, he would stand in front of the world and let them see him, not as a janitor, not as a ghost, but as the man he'd always been. The day of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the sun cutting through the early mist like a promise. Marcus woke early, dressing with care in a dark suit that had hung untouched in his closet for years. He looked at himself in the mirror, a man shaped by time and silence, and he let himself breathe deep. The streets around the Capitol were alive with color and sound. Flags snapped in the wind, and the low murmur of the crowd blended with the music of a military band warming up in the distance. Marcus walked slowly, each step measured, feeling the weight of the past and the possibility of what lay ahead. At the steps of the Capitol, a small stage had been built, draped in red, white, and blue. Rows of folding chairs lined the lawn, filled with faces both familiar and new. Some wore uniforms bright with medals, others simple civilian clothes, but all turned to watch him arrive. He saw Wilson there, standing at attention in his navy dress blues. Their eyes met, a shared moment of respect, and Wilson gave him a small, reassuring nod. Marcus felt the warmth of it settle in his chest. General Harris stood at the podium, his voice calm and solemn as he addressed the crowd. "Today," he said, "we gather to honor a man whose service was hidden in the shadows for far too long." He paused, letting the words sink in, then looked directly at Marcus. Marcus Johnson, known in the quiet places as Nighthawk, served his country with unwavering courage. Harris continued, "Though history tried to forget, we are here to remember." The crowd held its breath, the weight of decades of silence hanging in the morning air. The general's voice was steady, but Marcus saw the emotion in his eyes. "We, the United States of America, stand here today to say thank you," Harris said. "Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your service. And thank you for showing us that courage has many faces." He gestured for Marcus to step forward. The world seemed to still as Marcus walked to the stage, his legs steady even if his hands trembled. He paused at the bottom step, then climbed each one slowly, with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent his life in shadows. The general turned, lifting a small box from the podium. Inside was a medal, its gold edges catching the light. Marcus stared at it for a moment, then lifted his chin as the general pinned it to his lapel. Applause rose, not loud or boisterous, but deep and resonant. He could see tears in the eyes of old soldiers, and the quiet pride on the faces of those who had always believed. His own heart beat strong and calm, each breath a testament to the journey that had brought him here. When the general stepped back, Marcus turned to the crowd. For a moment, he just looked at them, these strangers and friends, these men and women who had chosen to stand with him today. He spoke softly, but his voice carried. "I was never looking for recognition," he said. "I only wanted to serve, to protect the men beside me. But today I stand here not just for myself, but for every man who was told to stay invisible." A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. His words weren't grand, but they were true. And in that truth, there was a quiet power. When he stepped down from the stage, hands reached out to him, grips that were strong, embraces that were brief but full of meaning. He moved through them slowly, each handshake a silent acknowledgement, each nod a quiet affirmation. Wilson was there too, his eyes bright with something like relief. "You did it," Wilson said quietly. Marcus shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "We did it," he replied. Off to the side, Marcus saw a small group of older men, faces lined with years and memory. His old team, those who had survived, those who had always known. They didn't need words. Their presence was enough. After the crowd began to thin, Marcus found a quiet corner near the marble steps of the Capitol. He sat down slowly, letting the sun warm his shoulders. For the first time in decades, he felt no need to watch his back. A young boy approached him, eyes wide with curiosity. "Sir, can I take a picture with you?" he asked shyly. Marcus looked at him, this child of another generation, and nodded. They stood together, the boy's small hand resting on Marcus' sleeve. The camera clicked, and in that brief moment, Marcus felt something like peace, a bridge between what had been and what could still be. When the boy ran back to his mother, Marcus closed his eyes and tilted his head back. The sky above was endless and bright, unbroken by clouds or shadows. He let the silence wash over him, a balm for all the years he'd held his breath. All around him, the echoes of the ceremony still lingered. The band's music, the general's words, the quiet applause of those who had borne witness. Each one a thread, weaving together the truth he had carried alone for so long. And in that quiet, he knew something deep and certain, that the world might forget names, might bury deeds in silence and shadow. But the truth has a way of finding light, of coming back to claim its place. As he rose to his feet, Marcus felt no weight on his shoulders, only a calm purpose, a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. He walked down those marble steps with steady steps, each one a promise to the men who had walked with him, unseen but never forgotten. For the first time in his life, Marcus Johnson understood that the truth cannot be buried forever, and that sometimes justice comes late, but it always comes. If you have the courage to wait, he walked on, into the light of the day, his name no longer a whisper in the shadows, but a testament to what it means to serve, to endure, and to finally be seen. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.